I want to talk a little bit about the context of gay liberation so that we understand what exactly people are referring to when they say things like out of the closets into the street. So one of the things I'm really interested in is the history of the closet as a kind of a seemingly universal experience of LGBT life in the United States. And so I want to look at that phenomenon a little bit by sort of pulling back from the 1960s and 1970s and looking a little bit at the longer history of the LGBT life in the United States, really starting in the 1920s. So before I do that, I want to start out with a set of questions that I began with whenever I started this project a few years ago. So like I said, the slogan most commonly associated with gay activism in the late 60s and early 70s goes something like out of the closets into the streets. So what is that? What is the closet? What does the closet have to do with sexual identity and LGBT life? Are the conditions of the Second World War conducive to people coming out of the closet? Are things getting better, and is that why people are beginning to come out of the closet and claim their LGBT identities in the 1960s and 1970s? So, kind of starting with this set of questions, I wanted to kind of look at the closet and exactly what it means. So when we talk about the closet, oftentimes we refer to these individual struggles that everybody goes to. People talk about this narrative of coming out of the closet and sharing information about themselves with family members or employers or friends, etc. So we sort of tend to assume that everybody comes out of the closet in order to be true to themselves. The closet refers now to all kinds of situations that have nothing to do with sexuality. So I just did kind of a scan of this morning's news. Presidential candidate Rand Paul announced that he was running for president. In one of the articles I happened to look at, he was referred to as a closet hawk, right? So this metaphor has been used in all kinds of contexts that have nothing to do with sexuality or gay life, right? One of the things that we might note here is that it's really about concealing and revealing information about oneself. So in order to understand how this intersects with and informs LGBT identities, we also have to understand how these histories kind of intersect. So one of the things we have to really kind of pay attention to is how people are coming to understand themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. There are also other identities as well, but how they come to understand themselves in this way in the first place, and what makes them decide to come out or not to come out, not to expose this information. So, what we see is basically a set of contradictions where this information is available, but it's kind of restricted. So people know about sexuality, but they know that certain kinds of sexualities are taboo. So at the same time that they learn about these alternate forms of sexuality and gender, they are also learning that they should not divulge this information about themselves, or they could potentially be punished, right? So at that point we have kind of the basic ingredients of the closet, right? The presence of information about alternative sexualities or gender, and also the information is presented in a context in which it's kind of stigmatized or criminalized. And I'll get to your questions at the end, I promise. So at any rate, what we have, or what I would like to look at, is not so much how the closet is kind of an identity crisis or some kind of existential struggle, but how it is a set of historical processes or historical conditions that shape the process of coming out. So that's kind of what we want to look at. One thing to keep in mind is that there are some people that conceal easier than others, more easily than others. And there are a wide variety of reasons for that. Some people feel more comfortable expressing their sexuality or gender identity. Some people simply cannot conceal it for whatever reason, right? So there are some people who are more liable to be sort of prosecuted or persecuted because they appear to be non-conforming in some kind of way. So, and that's through gender, right? So there are some people who are gender normative who can conceal their sexualities, but other people who are perceived as non-gender normative, they're not coming out of the closet because in some ways they're already identified and identifiable. So we have this kind of variety of ways that people are dealing with the closet. So, this is a picture of a man who's hiding his face after being arrested in a bar raid in Florida. So this is kind of the perfect metaphor to think about how the closet works for gender-conforming people, right? You know, otherwise, without being arrested, there's no indication that this person is gay. You know, he's wearing a flannel shirt and pants. The reason he's concealing his face is because he doesn't want his face seen in the newspaper, right? And then he could be identified by somebody that he knows. He could be ostracized or fired from his job or lose housing, that kind of thing. So, you know, this photograph, I believe, is from 1966. So, you know, how do we get from this point where people are hiding their identities to the early 1970s where people are sort of coming out of the closet, right? Out of the closet and into the streets. So, you know, one of the things that we have to look at is sort of 4 conditions that I want to focus on today. So one is that terms like homosexuality, transsexuality, and other terms that are used to describe sexual or gender aberrations have a very specific context that appears in a wide variety of contexts. So we have to understand how these identities come to be understood, how knowledge about these identities gets disseminated, right? So the second thing that we want to look at are the ways in which people have these kind of negative incentives to conceal their identities and the context in which people would come out, right? The kinds of incentives that would make them reveal their identities. So basically we have 2 sets of what we might think of as incentive structures, right? Or contexts where it might be not so good to come out and another context where it's good to come out. So the other thing that we have to look at are the kinds of social spaces where this information is circulating. So, you know, one of the things that I've looked at in my research is that people are really only kind of divulging their sexual or gender identities in certain kinds of contexts before the 1950s. So a psychiatrist's office is one place where it's safe to do that because you have confidentiality and the psychiatrist isn't going to tell on you, right? Or maybe in a confessional if you're talking to a priest or other clergy member. So the other context is gay bars. And these are really different kinds of contexts because if you come out to a shrink in the 1940s or 1950s, that is going to be so that you can perform or cure yourself in some kind of way. And there are all kinds of quack cures being peddled in the 1940s and 1950s to LGBT people, and none of them seem to work, right? So the other context is a gay bar. It's a lot easier to come out in a gay bar because everybody else is gay, and you're also coming out in either a value-neutral context where gay identity or trans identity doesn't mean anything, a negative or positive, or it's something that's actively affirmed by the other people in the bar. So, you know, where you come out is also kind of important because it determines how you might live your life. You know, if you come out in the context of a psychiatrist's office, you might spend the rest of your life trying to sort of behave in certain ways that conform to what is considered sexually normal or healthy. And you also might try to outwardly conform to ideas about what your gender comportment is supposed to be. If you come out in a gay bar, you know, you might want to come back next Friday or next Saturday night. You might meet friends, you might meet lovers, right? Basically, you have this context where you can develop a life that is, in many ways, a kind of alternative to the requirements to either get married or be celibate. So, and then, you know, finally, what you see in these spaces that are relatively stable is that they occur in a context where they're criminalized for a variety of different reasons, but mainly because there are, at least in the United States, there are all these liquor agencies, alcoholic beverage agencies that are set up by each of the 50 states that regulate how and where and when alcohol can be served. And almost all of these states, and especially the state of New York and the state of California, which are the 2 places I'll talk most about today, in those states it's illegal to serve homosexuals, right? And liquor licenses can be pulled from establishments that repeatedly serve people that are known to be quote-unquote perverts. And the laws use this kind of language, right? If you look at the laws from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you might see the term homosexuality, but more than likely you would see something like sex pervert or perversion or something like that. So anyway, these are the 4 basic characteristics that I have identified in my research as being important to forming the closet, right? So not only is it a space that sort of protects people from stigmatization, from criminalization, but ultimately in the 1960s it's going to be a place that people want to come out of, right? In some ways they want to break the boundaries between the closet and the straight world, and this happens because of politics, right? So, but in order to get there, we have to look at how the closet begins. You know, the closet is not this eternal structure that we can just read backward into the past and say, you know, everybody that's not out of the closet is in the closet. You know, it doesn't really work that way. So, you know, really, prior to the 19th century, there aren't really ideas about homosexuality. So, you know, first we have to look at knowledge about homosexuality. So, and there's a lot of information up here that I'm not going to go over, but I'm going to send this to Professor Razudik, and she can make this available to you if you want to read it. It just provides a little bit of a context for what we talked about today. Prior to the 19th century, there aren't terms like homosexual or transsexual to describe people that have sexual orientations that are not heterosexual or who are not gender-conforming people. So there are, at least in European and Euro-American context, there are laws that restrict same-gender sexual activity, sodomy laws, or sometimes they're called crimes against nature laws. And those are on the books in the United States, in some cases until 2003, and they're on the books in England until the 1960s. So, you know, there's a little bit of a contrast here when you look at continental Europe, because with a few exceptions, homosexuality is decriminalized after the early 19th century. So, you know, there is this a sort of context where this behavior is being criminalized, but it's not always understood to be a specific kind of identity. So people that are prosecuted for sodomy in you know, the periods before the 19th century are not always understood to be people that are repeatedly engaging in this behavior, right? It's a behavior, not an identity. You know, this really changes in the 19th century because medical doctors and especially psychologists begin to look at these people and say there's actually a personality trait in these people. There's something that links them together, and it's not just that they're breaking the rules that our society has set around gender and sexuality. It's that there's almost like an inherent personality trait that makes some people attracted to the same gender, or that makes some people wish they were in the body of another gender, right? And it's described usually in those terms in the 19th century. So, you know, the term homosexual is introduced in the very late 1860s. Although, if you're looking in this literature in the late 19th century, most of the time you see the term inversion, which implies, you know, this idea of having sort of a male brain in a female body, or a female brain in a male body. So these ideas become more and more kind of sophisticated in the 19th and early 20th century. So the term invert kind of fractures, and there are sort of two understandings of the invert. One is homosexuality, people who are attracted to the same gender but are otherwise gender-conforming people, and people who in the early 20th century are referred to as transvestites and later referred to as transsexuals, and that is people who identify as the gender that was not assigned to them at birth. So these are some of the ideas that people have in the late 19th and early 20th century. For the most part, when you see these words in medical textbooks, it's about how to cure these people. And there's a wide variety of ways that these scientists and medical researchers have to cure these supposed illnesses, none of which work, right? It isn't until the early 20th century that you have people like Magnus Hirschfeld, who's pictured here, who are actually engaging in these studies and are themselves gay or identify themselves as homosexual. So at any rate, I need to move on a little bit just because if not, we'll sort of get lost. But you know, if you're not reading medical textbooks, which is the vast majority of people, you know, where do you find out information about this stuff? Well, in the very late 19-teens and early 1920s, if you live in one of the major cities of the United States or Western Europe, you might notice that there is kind of an obsession with homosexuals, right? Or as they're referred to in popular culture, pansies, lesbians, fairies, bulldaggers, right? These are all the kinds of vernacular terms used to describe people that medical doctors are describing as homosexuals. So, and in the 1920s, it is, again, it's kind of a fad. And so, you know, there's sheet music published like this piece here that's called Masculine Women, Feminine Men, which is the rooster, which is the hen. So, you know, it's not just music that's being performed in nightclubs. You know, this is something that you could buy at a music store in, say, Big Spring, Texas, or North Platte, Nebraska, right? So, in some ways, ideas about, you know, these new kinds of stereotypes are being distributed across a much wider geography than if you just have a medical textbook. So, and the other thing about medical textbooks is a lot of them are written in Latin so that ordinary people can't understand them, right? You can look at this and you can clearly see what this is about. So, it's about homosexuality. So, in the 1920s, at least in the context of the United States, this pansy and lesbian fad kind of coincides with Prohibition. So, Prohibition is this period where alcoholic beverages are illegal to manufacture or sell, and many Americans are not really interested in following those laws. You actually see an increase in drinking of that period, which is, a kind of an indication of how well Prohibition policies work. At any rate, there are these illegal bars or speakeasies across the United States, and because people are already breaking the law, there is this a tendency to kind of accept people that are otherwise transgressive. So, this includes performers that perform as gay men or as lesbians or as pansies or lesbians. So, in the late 1920s, there was even a Broadway play called The Drag by Mae West. And I think it's like sold out for 2 weeks before it closes down. It's it's popular. It's panned in the New York Times as being like immoral and morbid and all of those kinds of things. But it's very popular. People want to see this stuff. There's a high demand for this information, but there is a kind of restriction on it, right? So this actually shows, when they were rehearsing for The Drag, they actually had to do rehearsals in New Jersey because they thought it would be easier to get away from the sort of moral entrepreneurs and the vice squads who were sort of trolling the theaters at the time to bring these obscenity prosecutions. And I think this is in Hoboken, they still got caught, right? They're getting arrested in the middle of a performance and the cops are walking them out. So, Mae West spends time in jail in the 1920s for violating obscenity laws for a number of different reasons, including, this play about gay men. It's called The Drag. So, and these are sort of drag balls from the 1920s, or this is a drag ball from the 1920s, sort of a Halloween costume ball in Greenwich Village. And this is actually a performer who's getting ready for the drag, so the Mae West play. In Harlem and in other African American communities, you also see this kind of sexual culture, and in many ways, it is incorporated into a culture of performance, right, where there's a kind of sexual spectacle on stage for people who are coming into Harlem to watch these programs. So in many cases, these practices have been identified as slumming practices, right? So white people or wealthy people go into working class neighborhoods or African American neighborhoods to see black culture performed on stage, whether as a jazz number or a blues number or something like that. But one of the other kinds of spectacles that you would see in Harlem in the 1920s and early 1930s is this spectacle of homosexuality or pansies and lesbians. So I guess kind of famous description of this scene is called A Spectacle in Color by Langston Hughes. So it's something that you can find in the literature of this period. One of the more famous performers is a performer named Gladys Bentley, who performs in a tuxedo and sings love songs about women. At one point, she even travels with one of her chorus girls down to Atlantic City, and they get married because the county clerk thinks that Gladys Bentley is a man. So this is a map of Harlem that shows Gladys Clam House, and you see a drawing of Gladys Bentley playing the piano. So there's a kind of a sexual connotation to the term clam house, right? That sort of indicates kind of lesbian sexuality there. So this is from about 1935. This is another view of the Ubangi Club, which is where Gladys Bentley was a featured performer. And Ubangi Club actually opens up after Prohibition. You see men dancing with men. You see this sort of kind of queer performance. So this is a drag show at Webster Hall. I mean, these are really big performances too. Thousands of people are attending these drag shows. So you find images of pansies and lesbians beginning to appear in comics. So you see it. These two of these comics are from a publication called Broadway Brevities. So, and these are a little bit raunchier, on the raunchier side. You see a sort of drunk pansy who's trying to pick up a drunk sailor. You see a gay man or a pansy trying to check into a women's hotel. So, but you also see it in more mainstream cartoons as well. There's kind of the sissy caricature in this Mickey Mouse cartoon. So it's beginning to trickle out into a sort of broader popular culture. So by the 1930s, prohibition is repealed. There is a kind of new regulation of these spaces, and one of the first rules that's passed by the State Liquor Authority of New York and the Alcoholic Beverage Control of California is that you can no longer serve homosexuals, right? Or I think the New York State law says sex perverts. And also cross-dressing or masquerading, right? Wearing clothes of the gender that is not assigned to you for whatever reason, whether you're performing or whether it's simply who you are, is an offense that you can be arrested for. So you see this kind of crackdown in the 1930s as a result of that. You don't see it everywhere. It doesn't affect everybody in the same way. This is something that I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about, but there are different experiences for women and men, right? So women in many instances are more easily able to get away with wearing men's clothing because it's seen as something ambiguous or even maybe alluring in a certain kind of way. So the sort of famous person that's associated with this style of dress is Marlene Dietrich, who is one of the most sort of biggest box office draws of the 1930s. And is a huge star and is obviously not being arrested for appearing in a tuxedo, right? At any rate, you do see this crackdown in other places. There's actually a film in early 1930s called Call Her Savage. It comes out in 1932, and there's a scene from a bar where there are these kind of gay performers, pansy performers, who are wearing tuxedos but with sort of chambermaid outfits on the outside, and their song is about how much they would like to serve on a frigate as chambermaids servicing the sailors kind of thing, right? So there's this kind of salacious implication there. By 1934, the Motion Picture Association of America passes a new set of regulations that forbid these images. So the last time you'll see an image of a gay bar in an American film is 1932, and you won't see this image again, or an image like this again, until the early 1960s when a movie called Advising Consent comes out. So by that time, when you see the bar in Advising Consent, you see people kind of covering their faces, right? So the closet is sort of in full effect. In a lot of ways, the closet is what comes after the lesbian and pansy craze, right? By the 1940s, if you see images of drag performers or people that are sort of indicating visible homosexuality, they're usually in the back of a paddy wagon. So these are photographs that were taken by Arthur Fellig, who's better known as Ouija. He's one of the most popular photographers in mid-20th century New York. And you see a wide variety of responses in the people that are being arrested. So some people are sort of hamming it up for the cameras. They obviously either don't care, or they figure, I've already been caught, I might as well make the most of it, right? And so you see a little bit of kind of resistance, maybe sort of dishing it out a little bit with the sort of performers on the right. The performer on the left looks genuinely distressed, right? So you have these very different kinds of responses to stigmatization and to the closet. So, one of the other major events that makes information about homosexuality known in the United States is the Second World War. Homosexuality is used as a sort of identifier to keep people out of the army. And this is because of a psychiatrist named Henry Stack Sullivan, who a lot of people have actually suggested was gay because he had a long-term male partner. But Sullivan is a psychiatrist. He's reading these European sexologists. And psychiatry and sexology is not as big a deal in the US until the 1930s and 40s because of people like Sullivan. At any rate, Sullivan basically says we have to be able to identify people who are unfit for military service. So one of the questions we should ask is about homosexuality. So what this means is that millions of Americans for the first time are hearing this word, who have never heard the word homosexuality before, who may not know what it means, except in the context of one of these board hearings. So you might know what homosexuality is if you live in New York and there's a pansy or lesbian scene close by. But again, if you live in North Platte, Nebraska or Big Spring, Texas, you may not have any clue about what these terms mean or what is implicated by them. But if you go before a draft board and they ask you these kinds of questions, you might start thinking about it a little bit, right? And start putting your own ideas together, talking to other people in the service. And in fact, ideas about homosexuality are disseminated so rapidly during the Second World War that it's sometimes referred to as this kind of national coming out. So in many ways, the same thing is true for lesbians, although women are not being drafted, and so they're not being confronted with this information in quite the same way. But you still have a lot of same gender contact between women, in part because women are going into the industrial workforce, and so for the first time they are living economically independent lives. There are alternatives to heterosexual marriage, and a lot of women are joining women's auxiliaries. And in fact, in many cases, lesbian networks in the 1930s sign up as groups in the early 1940s for these auxiliaries. And there are a lot of lesbians who are in the WAC and WAVE battalions. So obviously you also have this kind of changing of gender styles for women as well, right? So now it's acceptable for women to wear pants and sort of more masculine clothing. So in the late 1940s, even though there's this kind of crackdown on queens, on men who are performing as women, you don't see the same crackdown on women who are performing as men. And there is this kind of, there's like a little bit of a butch vogue in the late 1940s. So this is an advertisement for a show in San Francisco, including an advertisement with Gladys Bentley's name on it. So this is a performer from New York City named Blackie Cole. Famous performer in the Lower East Side in the 1940s and 1950s. So she has this kind of little scamp character that she plays. So, and the other thing that comes out of the 1940s and 1950s is a new way to signal lesbian desire, same-gender desire for lesbians. This is sometimes referred to as butch and femme. Butch femme is a kind of style where butch lesbians and femme lesbians, or sort of masculine performing lesbians and feminine performing lesbians, use symbols of femininity and masculinity to seek one another out, find one another out, and to organize their relationships. So, oftentimes, that a bar is a lesbian bar because of the presence of butches and femmes, right? And especially the butch. It's a very convenient symbol. It's a very easy way to signal lesbian desire. And at the same time, with a few exceptions, you can get away with it a little bit more in the 1940s, the late 1940s, because women's styles of dress have kind of changed. So, this is a butch femme couple in San Francisco. And, again, this is something that you see associated a lot with women who are in the industrial workforce, the wartime industrial workforce. So. This is another group of butch lesbians in the early 1950s. This is a butch femme couple from Buffalo. So, and by the way, a lot of this stuff comes from other people, so if you want a bibliography, I don't want to pass this stuff off as if it's my original research. There is a bibliography for this. This is the work of Elizabeth Kennedy and Madeline Davis. So in the late 1940s, you have this other event that kind of accelerates the distribution of information about homosexuality. You have the publication of what are called the Kinsey reports in 1948 and 1953. So the first one that comes out is called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and I actually have a copy of the Kinsey report here. And I actually used a lot of this for my research because I thought, in the late 1940s, if there's not ideas about homosexuality, how are people finding out where to go and that kind of thing? Well, if you look in the book and you look at the samples, Kinsey basically says there are some places, there are some large cities where there are actually bars and gathering spots for these people. So not only that, but he reveals that there's a large percentage of the population, of the male population, that has had sexual contact with another man to the point of orgasm, and approximately 10% of American men surveyed would prefer to have sex with men almost exclusively. So this is a jaw-dropping number for a lot of people, and there are a lot of problems with the Kinsey reports, but there were a lot of underestimates before. It's basically considered a problem that affects a few people who are isolated, who don't make up a very large percentage of the population, certainly not 10% of the population. That's more people than there are left-handers in the United States, right? It's a lot of folks. So it's kind of revealing for a lot of people, and it sort of sparks kind of political thinking on the part of LGBT people, because now they can think there's a demographic, right? There are other people like they're out there for me. There's a gay voting bloc, or there's a potential to form a political organization, right? And in a lot of instances, people read the Kinsey reports and they say, homosexuals are like Jews or African Americans, right? We are almost like an ethnic minority, except that unlike Jews and African Americans, we don't know about ourselves and we don't know where to find other people that are like us, right? And of course, there are a lot of other important differences as well, which I don't really have time to get into. In 1953, Kinsey publishes a report on the human female. So this is also similarly controversial because it reveals a level of lesbianism that had not been thought to have been occurring in the United States. Sorry for that awkward construction. But also there's a lot more shock about the fact that women are having premarital sex and masturbating. So there's a kind of double standard about male and female sexual behavior that's revealed in the reaction to the Kinsey reports. But this does kind of make known to the American public that sexuality is a lot more complicated than we might think if we just were to pick up an issue of Good Housekeeping or turn on the Donna Reed program, right? At any rate, this is a kind of raw material for a gay consciousness or an LGBT consciousness. So, the other thing that occurs in the early 1950s is the first a trans woman becomes a kind of a celebrity or an object of fascination in the news. A U.S. veteran of the Second World War travels to Denmark as a photographer, and while she's staying with her family, she meets doctors who have been working in endocrinology and in surgical transformations of genitals, and basically undergoes what then is called a sex change and what now is usually called gender affirmation surgery. And when she comes into the United States, there's a press conference at Idlewild Airport. She's met with all these cameras. You can actually go to YouTube and look up the newsreels. There are international newsreels about when Christine Jorgensen lands in the United States. And at first, she's kind of treated as a little bit of a celebrity. This is from the Daily News. It says ex-GI becomes blonde beauty. There's not a whole lot of judgment or stigma there. There's almost a kind of glamorous aspect of this. But within a few weeks of initial publication, there's a kind of negative reaction or backlash to Christine Jorgensen. And doctors refer to her as someone who's confused, who has mutilated herself. In the late 1950s, Arthur Schlesinger, who's famous as a Kennedy advisor, he writes this essay called A Crisis of American Masculinity, where he says, in this age where we have all these struggles in the Cold War, and we need men to be men, American men are faced with this personality crisis, and he refers to what he calls the Christine Jorgensen situation. He doesn't elaborate on that, but this is kind of an indication of masculinity in crisis. So you do see this very kind of complicated introduction of the idea of transsexuality in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. So in the 1960s, as a result, in part of Alfred Kinsey's research, a researcher named Harry Benjamin, who's been treating trans people since the 1920s, publishes a series of articles and ultimately a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon that comes out in the 1960s. And this makes known ideas about transsexuality. and also medical treatments for it. You know, what's kind of interesting, and this isn't something, again, that I have a whole lot of time to spend time on, is that while transsexual identities were kind of being medicalized and sort of described in these scientific terms in the middle of the 1960s, a lot of psychiatrists are looking at homosexuality and saying, you know, there's no mental aberration here, there's no mental illness here. So instead we need to sort of de-emphasize the medical model of homosexuality. In fact, in 1973, the American Psychological Association removes homosexuality from its list of mental pathologies. So, you know, the Cold War is also this period where information about homosexuality becomes known because there are all these purges in the military and in the federal government. In fact, there are more people purged for homosexuality than for ties to communism or suspected ties to communism. So, you know, the people that are kind of linked to this are Joe McCarthy and Everett Dirksen, two members of Congress who investigate homosexuality and homosexuals and go around the country. You know, McCarthy is one of these people who, you know, will like pull out a piece of paper and say, I have in my hand a list of X number of homosexuals in the State Department, and then he puts it away and never says anything about it again. So this is the kind of thing that breeds, you know, speculation and hysteria in the press, right? He's a sort of brilliant PR guy, even if he was kind of evil. At any rate, you know, if you think about what people are reading in the late 40s and early 50s, if you're reading Kinsey and you're reading, you know, about the McCarthy trials, then it becomes clear to you they could be everywhere, lurking under, you know, or lurking behind every bush, and, you know, even behind the nice houses with the white picket fences, kind of thing. So, you know, there is this kind of hysteria. There is, throughout the 1940s and 1950s, a kind of repeated crackdown on gay bars and other institutions, although there's relative tolerance on the West Coast. And so what you end up seeing are places like Seattle and San Francisco and LA gaining a reputation for being kind of gay towns, or towns where it's easy to relatively easy to go out and to socialize with others, as opposed to places like New York or Chicago, where the Vice Squad is still very active in shutting down gay bars. And in fact, in New York City in the early 1950s, there are some people who are writing about gay bars, so I guess you could find information about it, but they're gossip columnists, right? So if you read like the true crime sections of the New York Observer, you might read articles by people like Jack Late and Lee Mortimer, who are talking about ties between the gay bars in Greenwich Village and organized crime. So you have very different kinds of gay scenes develop on different coasts as a result of that. So this is you know, an advertisement from 1947 that shows a woman in you know, male costume performing at Mona's, and the sign says, where girls will be boys. So you know, there is a kind of relative toleration. So this is from another San Francisco establishment, Finocchio's. So, you know, you wouldn't see these kinds of advertisements in New York, right? In part because the police would just pick up the advertisements, go to the bar, and shut it down, right? So, you know, the police do know about these bars in New York City, but they're being bribed, right? So it's a different kind of dynamic. So another ad for Finocchio's. So you also get in the early 1950s a gay activism, some of the first gay activism, in part inspired by the Kinsey reports, right? The earliest homophile activists say, we know there are others out there who are like us, you know, now we just have to organize and then fight for our rights. So in the United States, the Homophile Movement draws inspiration directly from the African American Civil Rights Movement, including this model of identity where you know, homophile activists are called homophiles as opposed to homosexuals, right? And emphasizing love as opposed to sex. So you get that kind of respectability politics. At any rate, homophiles kind of use this model of a kind of ethnic minority to describe themselves, but more importantly, they use the tactics of the African American Civil Rights Movement. So things like sit-ins, peaceful demonstrations, pickets to draw attention to issues. You know, the difference is that while some Americans are supportive and sympathetic of the African American Civil Rights Movement, you know, typically liberal whites, nobody's really sympathetic to the homophile movement at all. And in fact, there's a review of the homosexual in America in, I think it's Ebony magazine. So this is the homosexual in America, which I have a really ragged copy. And they mention the fact that Corey tries to draw this parallel between homosexuals and African Americans, and the reviewer says, I'm not really sure about this comparison, right? This isn't exactly something that we would want to make known, right? Because it's something that could damage the credibility of the African American civil rights movement, besides which, if you're concealing your identity, then by definition you're not facing the kind of discrimination that African Americans face, because African Americans in most cases cannot conceal their identity, right? So it's a different kind of stigma, one that's visible and one that's invisible. At any rate, again, without this model, without these activist and identity models, the homophile movement in the United States probably would not have taken shape. So there is a kind of timeline of events, which I don't have time to go through, but again, this is information I'll make available later. I want to get through this just because we need to get into the 1960s. So one of the things that you see in California that you don't see so much of in New York City or in cities on the East Coast is the organization of homophile movements in the 1950s. So they plant chapters at the end of the 50s in places like Philadelphia and New York City and Chicago, but none of those chapters are as active or as powerful as the homophile organizations in places like San Francisco. And one of the reasons is because in San Francisco, it's not just people who are talking about civil rights or talking about legal representation or talking about psychiatric treatment of homosexuals. It's because you actually have an organization of bar owners, of gay bar owners. And in San Francisco, there's an organization called the Tavern Guild that's formed specifically to fight entrapment and to fight the prosecution of gay bar owners by the ABC, the California Alcoholic Beverage Control. And the Tavern Guild, as they're known, they're almost kind of like a sort of gay bar owners union, is very successful at winning the right to keep their doors open, serve whoever they want. And one of the people who's involved in the Tavern Guild and also an organization called the Society for Individual Rights is a performer at a drag club called the Black Cat named Jose Soria. And in 1961, they actually run him for city supervisor. And this is Jose in full dress. And you can see from the campaign literature a very totally different picture of Jose. He actually wins several thousand votes. He doesn't win the election, but it sort of shows that gay people do have some power in San Francisco. And after about the mid-1960s, you see less and less a sort of overt entrapment and bar raids in San Francisco. So you'll still see conflict between the police and gay people, but oftentimes it's conflict that happens in the street or conflict that happens in places that aren't gay bars. So some of the things that are beginning to change in the 1950s and 1960s that make it easier for people to conceal their identities, even as this information is becoming more known, is that aesthetics are, the aesthetics of the gay community and the aesthetics of American society are beginning to change. So in lesbian bars, butch femme roles are kind of abandoned in the 1950s and 1960s. And actually the lesbian homophile organization at the time, the Daughters of Bilitis, discourages its members from appearing in male dress. The older butch femme crowd refers to the new sort of genderless lesbians or more gender conforming lesbians as Kai lesbians or sometimes AC/DC because they switch between butch, they switch between butch and femme, right? You also see this kind of new masculine style among gay men. The earliest motorcycle clubs are formed, gay motorcycle clubs are formed in California in the 1950s, and this is a very different style of representing, same gender desire than the kind of pansies that we saw earlier, right? You have these big butch Marlon Brando types wearing like leather and denim and stuff like that, right? It's sort of signaling a very hard-edged homosexuality. So, the sissy doesn't disappear entirely. The sissy kind of goes underground and becomes this kind of coded figure. So, the sissy becomes the person that seems to always be speaking in a kind of code. This code is sometimes referred to as camp, right? It's something that means something to one set of people, but something totally different to another set of people. So I know some of you in the audience audience may have seen the sitcom Bewitched, right? You know, Samantha's uncle, who's played by Earl Lind, is kind of a closeted gay character. He never comes out on the TV show on Bewitched. He never says, I'm a gay man. But there are all these kind of subtle and not so subtle jokes that I think it's Uncle Albert is, you know, maybe a little bit different, right? So, you know, these camp styles are also pretty easy to, oh, this is my Kai Kai illustration. This is Edie Windsor and They Aspire, right? Edie was at the center of the lawsuit that overturned the Defense of Marriage, or parts of the Defense of Marriage Act a few years ago. So you see this sort of muted gender style in the 1960s. And this is my sort of camp illustration. You know, camp also becomes easier to hide in the 1960s because male fashions become more flamboyant. Right? If I told you, you know, spot the homosexual, it would probably be a little bit difficult to do without knowing the context of who the Beatles are and what the term camp means, right? So this just kind of flamboyant, colorful, psychedelic style makes it easier to kind of signal gay desire without necessarily coming right out and saying it. So, you know, here is my question as we move towards wrap up. Do you think conditions are getting better or worse for LGBT people in the post-World War II period? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say they are.
They're getting what?
They're getting better.
They're getting better. So, better?
I think they're getting more open. Certainly, I don't know whether better is coming out of it. There's still a stigma.
Right, so there's still a stigma attached, but openness, which you know, implies there's more information. So, yeah, you had your hand up.
You know, I'm disagreeing. It's much better.
It's better, yeah. Right, I mean, it seems to be both, right? I mean, you know, the way that I think about this, I'm a little bit of an, or I have become kind of an economic historian, so my mentors have sort of trained me in that way. But if you think about this as an economy, right, as a commercial economy of gay bars and other kinds of commercial institutions that you're accessing, you know, you have to have information, right, in order to access these places. You have to know where this is. So this is not only information about the bars themselves, but also information about LGBT identities, right? So, you know, what happens in the 1940s and 1950s if it's becoming more open, right, is that this information is becoming more available. So, you know, if you think about people in the 1920s and 1930s and how they're accessing this scene, they're paying what economists call high search costs, right? They're spending a lot of their time trying to figure out where these places are. So by the 50s and 60s, you know, those search costs begin to decline because you see representations of homosexuality in larger places. You see more references to gay bars, so you know where to find them. However, you know, the costs of protecting yourself start to rise, right? You know, one of the things that you see in the 1950s and 1960s is a rise in anti-gay violence, where LGBT people are being attacked on the street. So, you know, arrests for sodomy in New York State actually peak in the 1950s, right? So, you know, arrests and closures of gay bars sort of peak in the 1950s and 1960s. So just because information becomes more available doesn't mean that the stigma necessarily goes away. So you do have this kind of distorted, sort of a closet economy. But I really do want to sort of address the end of the 1960s, because how this contradiction gets resolved, right, where you're sort of seeing falling search costs where this is becoming more available but it's becoming more dangerous to access, is that you have to have a kind of political solution to the problem, right? This isn't just going to resolve itself on its own. So you see in the 1960s all of these, you know, what are basically revolts, right? Sort of popular revolts. And you see them in a wide variety of contexts. You know, there is like a sort of small kind of mini riot at a donut shop in Philadelphia in the early 1960s. You know, there are a sort of a similar outbursts in Los Angeles, in Chicago. You know, one of the biggest events that we can really call a riot occurs in San Francisco in 1966 at a place called Compton's Cafeteria. So Compton's Cafeteria is not a gay bar, so it's not one of these places that's being sort of shaken down and repeatedly raided or targeted. But Compton's Cafeteria is popular with transgender activists and transgender people who live in the Mission District of San Francisco. And the management tries to eject them, and they sort of call the police in. as the police are sort of forcibly removing these paying customers from Compton's cafeteria, there's sort of this huge eruption of violence, and it lasts for several days. This is really one of the first big kind of explosive riots that we might associate with gay liberation, but it's not one that we talk about very often. Maybe because it happens in San Francisco, maybe because it's a primarily transgender riot, maybe because it's sort of street people, homeless youth, impoverished people that are involved in this action. But in any case, this occurs 3 years before Stonewall. So, by the time Stonewall occurs, gay life is more or less decriminalized in New York City. The major homophile organization in New York is called the Manishing Society. In 1966, they had staged a sit-in, kind of a borrowing or copying the sort of civil rights repertoire of sit-ins in Greensboro and Nashville and other places throughout the South. And basically, they're trying to challenge state liquor authority laws that make it illegal for bartenders to serve homosexual patrons. So they call the New York Times, and they basically try to find a bar that will not serve them alcohol. And actually, the first couple of bars they go into, they ask to be served, and the bartender, and they tell the bartender that they're gay, and the bartender says, "Who am I to judge your private life?" Right? And I mean, it's also kind of a New York thing. If you're willing to pay money, you can pretty much buy anything that you want, which is why you have all these like 18 and 19-year-olds going to bars in New York and no other place in the entire country, right? So it takes them a while for them to find a bar where they will actually be refused service. They go to Julius Bar, which is still around, you can still go to it, and ask to be served, and they are refused service when they identify themselves as homosexuals. So, ironically, it's a pretty well-known gay bar. The difference between, the activists who are in here and everybody else is that everybody else was very discreet, and so they were basically able to sort of get away with it. At any rate, after this point, there are a couple of legal challenges. There's a shift in police policy and mayoral policy in New York City. And so as a result, gay bars are more or less decriminalized. So the question then becomes, why did the Stonewall riots occur? So the Stonewall is advertised in this magazine, which is called the Gay Scene Guide. It's published in 1969. I have this guidebook here called the Homosexual Handbook that's published in 1968. And the Stonewall is also in here, and I just dropped my bookmark, but let me find it really quick. Bear with me. Oh, I apologize. Although there's lots of really funny things here. So we will begin, I said, at the Stonewall. He's basically talking about giving his friend a sort of gay tour of New York City. Sometime between that agreement and our entry into the club, another acquaintance, Wally, of whom I spoke earlier, joined us for a night on the town. There's a catch in my throat as I mention his name. That man is living proof that a man can find happiness as a pixie at the age of 40 and beyond. The bar is on Christopher Street, just off Sheridan Square, and is reputed to be a private club. The burly at the door keeps boxes that hold, or are rumored to hold, thousands of cards upon which are printed the particulars of the many thousands of customers that have come and continue to patronize this place. On the weekends, there is a price of admission, which is euphemized into something else, but it's not so very much actually, only a couple of dollars or so. I have often seen lines or near lines outside on a Saturday night. So, this is one of the sort of ways that the Stonewall is described. In this publication, it's described as a good bar because they allow dancing, which is, I guess, kind of a rarity in most gay bars at the time, in part because of the New York City cabaret laws. You have to have a cabaret license in order to have dancing, and I guess a lot of these places are private clubs where you have to actually buy membership. And the reason for that is that it's harder for the police to get into them. So, at any rate, the reason that the Stonewall is raided is not because it's a gay bar or because they are catering to gay customers. The reason it's raided is because of its associations with the Genovese Criminal Corporation, which had basically run organized crime in Greenwich Village. So the police department, the federal investigators as well, conduct this raid on the Stonewall bar, and they don't tip off the local police department. And the reason they don't tell them is because the local police department is on the take, right? And they will tip off the bar owners. And the reason that they're going to raid this place is because the owners are blackmailing the customers in the gay bar. So at any rate, police show up and they start arresting patrons. Now the patrons haven't done anything wrong, but they're in this criminal business. So they're being sort of lined up in the paddy wagon. And at one point, at least according to a lot of the eyewitnesses that are there, a butch lesbian who is not happy with how she's being manhandled smacks a cop in the face, and all of a sudden it's kind of like all hell breaks loose, right? And for 3 days there's rioting in Greenwich Village. It's a huge riot. It gets pretty big coverage, unlike a lot of the other sort of actions or rebellions that I discussed before. And the press is really taken aback that gay people would respond in this militant, aggressive way, right? This is kind of stereotype that these are people that are just going to take it, you know, and they're too kind of weak or effeminate or disorganized or whatever to actually fight back against this sort of police force. So within a year after the Stonewall riots occur, these organizations called the Gay Liberation Front begin to pop up across the United States. And a year later, the owner of the first gay and lesbian bookstore, which had opened just 3 years before, organizes a commemoration parade for the Stonewall riots. So by the 1970s, what you end up seeing is a kind of shift away from these black market economies and from a total reliance on bars and these other kinds of commercial institutions to a sort of gay community in Greenwich Village where sort of residents and businesses are being encouraged to come out of the closet and form new kinds of institutions that would make it possible for other people to come out of the closet, right? So now the sort of organizing principle of gay life is not how to conceal your identity from the outside world, but how to come out in such a way that makes it possible for future generations to come out. So it's about sort of the extension of this community. So, and these are some of the images from the Stonewall bar. And it splits the activist community in New York, right? The Mattachine Society kind of, or at least the older leadership of the Mattachine Society, has kind of a negative reaction to the Stonewall riots. The president of the Mattachine Society at the time tries to blame it on yippies and Black Panthers and outside agitators. He posts a sign in the broken out window of the Stonewall that says, you know, basically comport yourselves. You know, we plead with you to be peaceful on the streets. You know, act respectable. So. More than anything else, though, this is the kind of graffiti that follows the Stonewall riot. Gay prohibition corrupts cops, feeds mafia. So it's kind of a protest against the sort of black market that has sort of defined and restricted gay life in the late 1960s. And again, these are some more images from Stonewall. And as a result of the founding of these organizations, you also get the earliest transgender organizations in the United States, or not in the United States, but in New York City, after transgender activists were kind of excluded from gay male spaces, right? And the same thing happens with lesbians who are not only excluded from gay male spaces, but also spaces in the women's movement as well. And again, I'm just kind of glossing over this, so if you're interested in this information, it is actually on the slide. So that sort of brings me an end to my talk. You know, my sort of conclusion is that if we want to understand the politics of LGBT life in the US, we need to really systematically study the ways in which the central organizing principle of LGBT social life transitioned from concealment and coming out to the gay world to this idea of coming out of the closet. So this is not accomplished through gradual change or a slow process of progress and amelioration, but rather through direct political action and agitation, as well as new forms of knowledge and sociability, both of which are really framed by the market. So that's kind of my argument and my conclusions here. So, yeah.
Didn't it take the gay and lesbian community a long time to accept bisexuals and transgender in the same banner as they? And I would submit that, based on your central question, has it gotten better or worse? I think it's gotten better for the lesbians and gay men. However, I think the straights are still scratching their heads on transgender. And the reason for that is that the gays and lesbians did not accept them into the movement as quickly as they should have.
Well, that's absolutely right. You know, Sylvia Rivera, who's pictured here, was actually physically attacked by other members of a gay organization when she attempted to speak about transgender rights. So, you know, until very recently, the Human Rights Campaign, which is the biggest gay or one of the biggest gay lobbies in the United States, I don't know if it's the biggest, kind of refused to talk about transgender issues because it was seen as politically perilous. So there have been lots of exclusions of trans people. You know, what's interesting is this is an anthology of gay liberation writings. You do see gay men, lesbians, and bisexuals represented here. You know, there's an interview with Marcia Johnson, but otherwise, transgender and transsexual people are more or less invisible from this text. So, you know, there is a tendency not to link these two issues together. And of course, the sad irony is that people that are most likely to face violence, harassment, arrest are transgender people or gender nonconforming people. So, but by the early 1970s, there is this kind of reaction for a variety of different reasons. You know, a lot of which just kind of has to do with sort of internalized transphobia of the movement. And of course today, you know, if you look at where violence is occurring, transgender people are killed on average about once a week in this country. And this is still something that has been impossible to talk about in our society. So, and I think a lot of that has to do with sort of cisgender gay men and lesbians ignoring those issues. Well, and it's so very complicated because it seems like things will improve in one area and sort of slide back in another. You know, one of the reasons I'm interested in this project is because I grew up in West Texas, where I didn't have a whole lot of information. So the first time I remember the first time I heard the word homosexual, I was like 11 years old, which is really old for a person of my generation. Now, had I lived in Dallas or Austin or you know, New York City, I most definitely would have known about this. I would have had access to that information. By the time I was finding out about it, though, I was finding out about it in a context where homosexuality was a signal of the end times and the end of civilization. And so when I started thinking about myself in those terms, I thought of myself as a monster. I didn't come out of the closet until I was 21 years old. So the kind of impact that the dissemination of this information has, I think is, it's uneven, right? There is progress in some places and sort of backsliding in others, or I don't know that I would call it backsliding. Just trying to stay away from my earlier religious metaphor, but you know, the kind of decline of conditions, of social conditions. The earlier point goes about Tim Cook. I mean, you know, he's been in the news this week for criticizing the Indiana law that was just passed, but I think that's also a good example of how things are not always moving in a progressive direction for LGBT people, depending on what part of the country you're in. So, you know, 2015 may be a great place to be gay in Brooklyn, but not so great in Indianapolis. No, I didn't, and I don't necessarily accept that by granting LGBT people equal rights, it tramples on the right of people to discriminate. You know, I don't agree with that position. But you know, the other thing is that there is a lot of stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of history. I mean, there's a lot of good and bad. I mean, these people are not like just absolute heroes. I mean, I'm not trying to present a hagiography or anything. So, you know, this is a very complicated history, and people act in ways that are not always admirable, oftentimes because of the conditions that they're in. So, you know, we talked about infighting between gay men and lesbians and transgender people, and that's one of the very negative aspects of this history, and one of the sort of ways in which activists are kind of unable to resolve some of the lingering problems in the community. So, you know, there are issues of racism and classism in the community, and that's important as well. You know, it is a very, very complicated history, but I don't think that I presented a hagiography here. So, yeah, I mean, the other thing is, though, I do reject this kind of way in which we have been forced to choose between gay rights and religious rights. I just don't think that makes very much sense to me. And I did grow up in the church. My father is a church choir director. You know, these are things that I know very well about. And I grew up in the Methodist Church, which is now struggling over these issues. So I just don't understand how recognizing LGBT rights or baking a cake for somebody is trampling on the rights of a baker or something like that. I mean, you know, there really is a double standard when it comes to the way that homosexuals are treated versus everybody else, right? You know, as far as I know, I've never heard of a cake baker who refused to bake a cake for a second wedding. You know, and I've read the Bible, and Jesus talks a lot about how divorce is wrong, but he doesn't actually mention homosexuality. So, you know, we can parse these issues out, but I don't agree with your assessment.
Well, no, I wasn't making an assessment. I was asking you if you thought it was important to make sure you didn't trample on someone else's rights in order to advance yours.
I don't think that that's happening.
No, I didn't say what I'm saying. I was asking if you agreed that it was not good to do that. That was my point.
Sure, it's not good to do that, but I also say it's not happening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Democrats.